Hello, I'm Mike Scott in Oxford in the UK. Welcome from me and from Mike Collins in Maryland to the second event in our new Zoom season of Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, where we're bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary cultural debates. Today, Jasmine Jones will be discussing Beowulf. Jasmine is stipendiary lecturer in English 1650 to 1550 at St. Peter's College, Oxford, and college lecturer in English at Pembroke College, Oxford. She's completing a PhD at St. Edmund Hall, Oxford, where she has been the Clarendon Scholar and Bruce Mitchell Scholar of Old and Middle English. She studies the earliest literature that survives in the English language, Old English religious verse, composed by monastic poets around 700 to 850 AD. Her research focuses on the theology developed by this poetry, discovering the possible influence of diverse spiritual traditions on the early English church. She explores how the vernacular religious poetry was a dynamic medium for communicating complex and original theology in this early period. She has recently published a chapter on the poetic origins of English spirituality in an essay collection on the Christian literary imagination, published by Vernon Press, and an article on early medieval Mariology in the Review of English Studies. She has also published an article in the Spanish journal Silum on Old English literature during the reign of King Alfred the Great. If any questions occur to you during this talk, please type them in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Use the Q&A button, please, not the chat button on your computer. Towards the end, I will ask, and Mike Collins will join me, to ask as many questions as possible to our guest to answer. Please don't leave your questions to the last minute, as we may run out of time. I'm really looking forward very much to this lecture. Over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very honoured to be speaking today from Oxford as part of this lecture series for the future of the humanities. Beowulf, probably the text from early medieval England, which is most well known to the general public. However, other than the sliver of society which has often reluctantly studied the poem as part of more traditional undergraduate English courses, the majority of people know Beowulf as mediated through modern-day translation or as interpreted through screen adaptation. Many usually consider Beowulf an eccentric text, the bewildering invention of a quirky mind, or as a lengthy and boring text, containing very little to which we can now relate. Dismissals of Beowulf are often based on misconceptions of the early medieval period as the Dark Ages, primitive, gloomy, and backwards thinking. In my talk today, I will offer close reading analysis of Beowulf in the original Old English to argue for the poem's importance at the beginning of English literary and theological tradition. I will demonstrate how important Beowulf is to a study of cultural encounter, given its reflection on two main themes, which I'll take in turn: religion and Germanic heroic culture. Beowulf survives to us today in only one manuscript, the Noel Codex depicted here. This dates from around the end of the 990s or the early 1000s. However, studying the language and meter of Beowulf indicates that the poem itself was actually composed centuries earlier than this manuscript, maybe in the late 7th or early 8th century Northumbria. So, the sophistication of Beowulf reflects the advanced thinking of the English people in their very beginnings. To begin, I will give a brief synopsis of the poem. Beowulf is an Old English poem, set entirely in Scandinavia, probably set around the 6th century. The Danes, led by King Hrothgar, are in trouble because a monster called Grendel has attacked their mead hall. King Hrothgar recruits Beowulf, a renowned warrior from a different tribe known as the Geats, to come and rescue the Danes from this monster. Beowulf successfully wins a battle against Grendel in the mead hall, but then the mother of Grendel, who is another monster, comes to avenge the death of her son, and she attacks the mead hall too. Beowulf then travels to the underwater home of Grendel's mother, where he defeats her. The poem then fast forwards by 50 years, so we get an older Beowulf, and he's now king of the Geats. He must now fight a dragon who has burnt the Geats' hall, and it's in this third and final fight that Beowulf requires assistance from his comitatus, his loyal band of warriors, but they cowardly desert him, except for one, Wiglaf, who helps him to kill the dragon. Nevertheless, Beowulf suffers fatal wounds, and the poem closes with the hero's tragic death and the end of his lineage. Religion is a theme through which Beowulf clearly demonstrates cultural encounter, as the Christian poet of Beowulf speaks about the pagan past from which the English originated. As I mentioned, Beowulf dates from roughly around the 8th century, and at this time, it was only really monasteries that had the resources that would be necessary for composing an epic poem like Beowulf. When missionaries arrived in England from Ireland and Rome in the late 500s, they brought with them many books, including books of grammar, history, philosophy, theology, and they established monasteries in which these books were kept. In this early period of English history, then, it's monasteries that are the intellectual epicenters. They form the first libraries and the first educational systems. And it's almost certainly within this setting that Beowulf was composed. Since the poet has very intricate knowledge of warrior culture, it's more likely that they're a monk than a nun. This monastic origin of Beowulf is particularly evident in the poem's deep reflections on God as creator. Beowulf includes several ruminations on creation, and these suggest a monk's monastic reading, his imaginative contemplation of the book of Genesis or the Psalms as part of Lectio Divina, the slow and thoughtful practice of sacred reading. For example, a poet in the Danish mead hall sings a song about creation. Se almitia I orthan vorta, wlita bjort no wang, swa water bebuget. Jesette si harithe, sunan und monan, leomen til liokte, landboendum, ond je fatwada folden shiatas, leomum on liafum, lief iadje sheop, kunna hu wilchum, farathe quich quidifaf. The Almighty created the earth, the shining bright plain, as water surrounds it. Victory triumphant, he established the sun and moon, luminaries as lights for the land dwellers. And he adorned the corners of the earth with branches and leaves. He also shaped life for each of the kinds which move around alive. Later on in the poem, the poet's narrative voice refers to the sun as Liocht Iasten kom, Bjort beacon goddess. Light came from the east, the bright beacon of God. The poet makes another reference to God's relationship with creation when he describes how Beowulf's sword melts in the heat of the dragon's breath. Isa Jelikost, såna forstes bend, fader on lateth, on windet walrapas, so je wield hafa sala und mala, that is soft metod. Most like ice, when the Father loosens the fetter of frost, unwinds the water's ropes. He has control over times and seasons. That is the true measurer. In this final quotation, I particularly like how God is portrayed as almost manually detaching the frost from the landscape, untethering the frost from the surfaces to which it is attached. So here you can see a series of very detailed and quite beautiful descriptions of creation, which are scattered throughout the poem, and they indicate a sustained focus on God's agency in his initial act of creation. God's majesty is revealed in what he makes, and it's reflected in his ongoing authority in governing the created world. In a previous lecture that I gave for the Future of the Humanities project, as part of their series on the environment, a bent but beautiful world, I gave an overview of the theological treatment of creation across early Old English monastic poetry. And I began with Caedmon's hymn. This is a 9-line poem, considered one of the first in the English language, which praises God for his creation. Nu schollen erian, Beowulfan riches wead, mio todes meacte, ond his moji thonk. We ork wil de vader, zwa he wondra johaz, etje driekten, or onstialde. He arrest shiop, iorthan bianum, he olfen te grove, hali shipend. Va midden yard, mon kunnes wead, etje driekten, athetiod, firum foldan, Freya Almighty. Now we must praise the guardian of the heavenly kingdom, the might of the measurer and his mind's thought, the work of the glory Father, and of each of his wonders, the eternal Lord established the beginning. He first shaped for the children of earth heaven as a roof, the holy shaper. Then the guardian of mankind, the eternal Lord, afterwards furnished middle earth, the land for people, the Lord Almighty. Given the shared concerns and similar phrasing, such as the immanent and tactile understanding of God as shipend, the shaper, and references to him furnishing the created world, Tioda Firum Foldan, it's clear that Beowulf is participating in the same spiritual tradition as Caedmon's hymn. And like in early medieval English theology more broadly, Beowulf emphasizes the importance of creation's beauty in reflecting the beauty of its creator. Aside from creation, another way in which Beowulf enables us to encounter the spiritual beliefs of the early medieval English is through repeated references to the Judeo-Christian God. Now, it's crucial to note that the characters within Beowulf are not Christians. They are living in a place which Christianity has not yet reached, and they worship pagan gods. However, the whole poem is full of reflections on the Judeo-Christian God. This is from the perspective of the Christian monastic poet, as we might expect, but also, strikingly, from the perspective of the pagan characters themselves. So we have a Christian monastic poet writing about a pagan past and deeply thinking about the relationship of the pagan ancestors of the English with the Judeo-Christian God. And it's this which demonstrates an interest of others in their otherness. To give some examples, Hrothgar, the pagan king of the Danes, acknowledges that everything he owns is what God has given him. And he perceives Beowulf's victory over Grendel as occurring through the might of God. Later, Beowulf reflects on how it's only the protection of God that enabled him to survive against Grendel's mother, since God granted him the opportunity of finding a sword nearby, which helped him to defeat her. Then Wiglaf states that it's God who granted Beowulf the opportunity to fight the dragon. And finally, Hrothgar warns Beowulf against pride, reminding him that mighty God in his great mind dispenses wisdom, land, and lordship. He is in control of all things. Sometimes in the poem, the will of God is quite explicitly mentioned. So Grendel is not able to succeed in attacking men if God did not want that. And when Beowulf wonders why Grendel did not stay in the mead hall to die there, he realizes this was something that God did not want. The truth of Christianity is thus portrayed as having stretched back all the way, existing even before Christianity had actually arrived in Scandinavia. It's therefore suggested that the Judeo-Christian God was always there for mankind, protecting him and giving him the graces that he needed. Another prominent feature of theology in Beowulf is the focus on offering thanksgiving and praise to God, and this is a recurrent motif in Old English religious poetry. We saw this earlier in Cadman's hymn, which promotes praise of God for his generosity to man in creation, and we see this same act of thanksgiving in Beowulf. So Hrothgar thanked God, the mighty Lord, for enabling Beowulf to speak about his victory over Grendel's mother. And Beowulf's men thanked God when Beowulf returns safely, as does Beowulf's own king. He thanks God when he sees Beowulf return safe and sound. In summary, then, these inserted references to the Judeo-Christian God throughout the poem really tell us two things. Firstly, they tell us that Beowulf witnesses to the concern of an English Christian poet who is attempting to reconcile his faith with the pagan heritage of the English. The poet's narrative voice inserts several comments on the paganism of these Scandinavian ancestors of the English. The narrative voice refers to these ancestors as fremde theod, etian drikten, a people alien to the eternal Lord. And he gives an account of them worshipping pagan gods, praying to them for protection from Grendel. After this account of them worshipping these pagan idols, the poet comments, Metod hier nukuthon, dada dement, ne wiston hier drikten God, ne hier hodo hiofana hem, herian nukuthon, wuldres, waldend. They did not know the measurer, the judge of deeds, nor did they know the Lord God, nor did they indeed know how to praise the protector of the heavens, the wielder of glory. The poem also contains reflections on the transient features of this pre-Christian life, particularly the redundancy of treasure, which has so much value, but eventually becomes useless and decays. In addition, throughout the poem, the poet inserts kind of aphoristic or even homiletic reflections on the truth of Christianity, which the pre-Christian characters of Beowulf do not consciously know, but which they are portrayed as inherently believing. The poet is thus ambiguous about the afterlife which the pre-Christian Beowulf receives. It's stated that his soul sought sothfastrodom, the judgment of the righteous, but it's not clear if this means favorable judgment because his soul is righteous, or if it means he received unfavorable judgment by those who are righteous. All of these references to the Judeo-Christian God by pre-Christian characters suggests that the Christian monastic poet believes in the natural goodness or the natural knowledge of God, which was possible for the pagan ancestors of the English. These pagan ancestors, at this point, as I mentioned, had not had Christianity revealed to them. Nevertheless, they live in a righteous manner, informed by innate convictions of a Judeo-Christian God. This is perhaps similar in some way to the Old Testament righteous who lived prior to Christ's incarnation and, as Christian tradition believes, were rescued by Christ from the underworld and eventually led to heaven. In addition to these references to God, the poem also contains many biblical allusions and parallels, which prompt further reflection on the relationship of the pagan past to the Christian present. By the early 8th century, which is the probable time of Beowulf's composition, there were many texts circulating known as apocrypha. These were not part of the canonical scriptures, but they were highly influential on early medieval theology. A key apocryphal text, which in some form influenced the Beowulf-poet, is the Book of Enoch. This describes the fall of the angels and the race of giants which descended from them. In Beowulf, the monster Grendel is referred to in the lines Fifel kunis iad, one saliwer wiado de huile, Stefan himshipend for skrifen hafte in Canis kunna. Grendel is an unblessed man who dwelt for a while in the land of the giants, after the Shaper had condemned him among the kin of Cain. So we see that Grendel is related to Cain and suffers the same exile and estrangement from mankind as Cain did for punishment for killing Abel. The fall of the angels narrative also seems to inform many aspects of the poem's content. For example, the focus on the rise and fall of proud kings, about which Beowulf is warned. Another well-known apocryphal text in early medieval England and a possible influence on Beowulf is the Visio Sancti Pauli. This text narrated very vivid visions of heaven and hell, and in particular, the descriptions of hell resemble the depiction of Grendel's mother's underwater home. And I would say the Visio Sancti Pauli contributes to the apocalyptic quality of many other scenes in the poem. The Book of Kings and the Book of Samuel in the Old Testament have also been suggested as influences on Beowulf, given the biblical precedent for David fighting the giant Goliath and the poem's similar emphasis on wisdom, as well as the succession of kings. I'd also suggest some parallels of Beowulf with the Gospels, given that the character of Beowulf potentially has some Christ-like resonances. At the beginning of the poem, Beowulf is certainly portrayed as a savior-like figure who is redeeming the Danish people from the attacks of a demonic foe, Grendel. Perhaps more strikingly, towards the end of the poem, when Beowulf attempts to kill the dragon, all except one of the 12 in his band of warriors desert him in his hour of need. I think there's possibly correspondence here to the 12 disciples of Christ, most of whom go to sleep in the Garden of Gethsemane during Christ's agony there, and they do not accompany him when he is arrested. Considering all these possible intertextual connections, I'd argue that Beowulf was composed with a vibrant apocryphal and biblical imagination, again reinforcing the likelihood of a monastic poet, given how a monk's daily life would be saturated in scripture through praying the liturgy and sacred study. And here is an image of the Lindisfarne Gospels, which were composed in the same place and around the same time as Beowulf. So you can see the reverence and lavish decoration that is given to the sacred scriptures at this time. A final aspect of religion in the poem that I'll now address is the poem's understanding of reality through the paradigm of spiritual battle. This outlook is one that I found reflected across early Old English religious poems, and this would suggest that it's a defining characteristic of theology at the time. The entirety of Beowulf is structured as a conflict between the forces of good, aligned with the Judeo-Christian God, and the forces of evil associated with Satan. This perception of the threat of satanic evil is perhaps most evident in the poet's portrayal of Grendel's approach to the Danish hall. There kom of mora under mistliothum Grendel gongan, godes ire bar, Mintisim manskatha manakunas, sunna bisirwan in seletham hiam, Brathe after thon on fine the floor, fion tredode, iode irmod, him of iam stod, lia yelikost, liot on fair. Then came from the moor, under the misty slopes, Grendel, going. He bore the anger of God. The evil harmer intended to ensnare some of mankind in that high hall. Immediately afterwards, the fiend trampled upon the paved floor. He went angry-minded. Out of his eyes stood an unbeautiful light, most like a flame. This depiction of Grendel as approaching under Mistliotham, under the misty slopes, immediately conveys the eeriness of Grendel and his ominous self-concealment in the mist, whilst the reference to him as bearing the anger of God, God is Erebar, positions him as an opponent to God in a binary of good and evil. Various epithets for Grendel more explicitly align him with Satan. He is a manscather, an evil harmer, and he's also a fiend, with flame-like light penetrating from his eyes, which carries hellish connotations. The extract continues, Sonnebat on funda firana hirde, that hine mette midinjades iorthen shiata on erlan men mund grippemaran, he on moda wiart fjort on ferthe, north he aard from miakte. Here was him hinfus, wolde on hilste fleon, sekan diofe gedrag, godes ansakan, sielias nesang, sar wanian, helle hafton. As soon as that shepherd of sins found out that he had not met in Middle Earth, across the corners of the earth, a greater hand grip in any other man, in his heart, he became afraid in mind. But none the sooner could he go from there. His mind was ready to depart. He wanted to flee into the darkness, to seek the band of devils. The adversary of God sang. Deprived of victory, he lamented his pain, the captive of hell. What's interesting is that in Christian texts, the noun heerd in the first line here usually refers to a shepherd, meaning a pastoral leader, like a bishop or like Christ himself. But here, it's Grendel who is the heerd, and he's the Firenna heerd, meaning the shepherd of sins. This demonstrates Grendel's blatant subversion of goodness and his direct opposition to Christ. On realizing that he stands against the superlative strength of Beowulf, Grendel attempts to escape. This is described as Grendel wanting to on heels to fleon, to flee into darkness, and sekan diofla yidrag, to seek the company of devils. These phrases again are very evocative of Satan. The technique of poetic variation, which is when the same concept is expressed in diverse but synonymous ways, enables the poet to accentuate the devilishness of Grendel and his conflict with God. So he's Godes Ansakan, God's adversary, as well as Helle Hafton, a captive of hell. Hopefully my textual analysis of Beowulf so far has highlighted the nuances of this very complex and sophisticated poem in revealing the cultural encounter of religion which the poet explores. The poem particularly witnesses to broader theological preoccupation with creation and suggests the possibility of pre-Christian people having faith in a Judeo-Christian God, and witnesses to the influence of apocryphal texts and the Bible in early medieval England. As I've just shown, the poem also reflects the common perception of reality as spiritual battle. This theme of battle is also relevant to the next topic that I want to cover as another important example of cultural encounter in the poem, the Germanic heroic culture which the poem depicts and in which it was composed. This map indicates the movement of migrants from northern Germany and Scandinavia between 400 and 600 AD, as the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes settle in post-Roman Britain to form what will eventually become England. These newly arrived tribes have brought with them the Germanic heroic culture in which they lived before migrating, and it's this culture in which Beowulf is set. Although Beowulf is an Old English poem composed in Northumbria, none of the poem's narrative takes place in England. It's entirely set in Scandinavia. Many aspects of this Germanic heroic culture permeate life in England, particularly the comitatus structure and the centrality of the mead hall to this. The comitatus refers to the bond between a warrior lord and the band of warriors who serves him, and this hierarchical unit structured Germanic heroic aristocratic warrior society. There was an important two-way relationship within this bond. The band of warriors promised absolute fidelity to their warrior lord, particularly pledging full support of their warrior lord in battle. So this would mean fighting alongside their warrior lord in battle and never deserting him on the battlefield, even if he were to die. In that case, it's most noble to fight until the end of the battle with the aim of winning it, or to fight until death alongside their lord. The band of warriors would also be responsible for publicizing widespread praise of their lord and spreading knowledge of his reputation. In response to these contributions of his warriors, the warrior lord would bestow treasure upon them, like gold rings or swords, and this ritual was known as gift-giving. The comitatus is therefore this reciprocal relationship between a warrior lord and his men. The mead hall, depicted here, is the central social hub for the comitatus and the wider community too. It's here that a comitatus would rejoice in their military victories by drinking mead, sharing a meal, and listening to poetry and music in celebration of their triumph. The mead hall is also the location where the warrior lord would offer boasts, that is, speeches of self-promotion, demonstrating prowess in war and boosting the morale of the comitatus, ready to face future challenges. There are several poignant moments in the poem which focus particularly on the fidelity which is so crucial to the comitatus bond. These moments are concentrated at the end of the poem, when it's Wiglaf who is the only member of the comitatus to help Beowulf in his fight against the dragon. Wiglaf encourages his fellow warriors to remember their time with Beowulf, drinking mead together with him, when he would give them rings, battle garments, helmets, and swords in exchange for their loyal support of him in battle. Wiglaf stresses that Beowulf chose them, perceiving them worthy of glory. Wiglaf comments, God wat on metje, dat mi is mich le liofre, dat mine like man, mit mine golgifen gled fat mie. Ne thinketh mi jerisne, dat we rondes beren eft jade, nemne we aror meen, fane je filan, fjord I alian, wedra fjordnes. God knows, for my part, that it would be much more desirable for me that fire embraces my body alongside my gold-giving lord. It does not seem fitting to me that we should bear our shields back to our land, unless we beforehand might destroy the hostile one, save the life of the prince of the Weathergeats. The Beowulf poet then refers to Wiglaf once more, and his subsequent speech to his fellow warriors, those who deserted Beowulf. Thar was at them jongan, grim and swaru, ethbiete, danthi his elne folias, wergendra tillit, throng imbethioden, thahinus thrag bequam, death bith sella, iola wilchem, thona ed witle. Then was that young man prepared with a grim answer for those who before had forsaken their courage. Too few protectors thronged around the Lord when his time came. Death is better for any warrior than a life of disgrace. Wiglaf's behavior and speech thus demonstrates the unbreakable fidelity of a warrior to his lord within a comitatus structure, and the shame that is associated with those who do not fight alongside their lord or on his behalf in battle. The importance of this bond culturally was meant to override even the strength of family blood ties. Finally, the mead hall is the last aspect of Germanic heroic culture about which I'll talk today. The mead hall, as I mentioned, was a very important place in aristocratic warrior society, particularly because of its role in communal bonding. This is why Beowulf is summoned by the Danish king to help fight Grendel in the first place. It's the mead hall where the monster is lurking around, threatening the very life of their community from which the monster is isolated. It's in the mead hall that Beowulf achieves victory over Grendel, and it's in the mead hall that he celebrates this triumph with his comitatus. Women also play a vital role in mead hall life. They give speeches of their own, and they function as peace weavers. This meant passing around a cup of mead from which the men should each drink, in a symbolic ritual reinforcing the warrior's companionship. The mead hall is also the site of literary production. It was very traditional for a court poet, someone like a bard or a minstrel, to recite stories in verse form, maybe accompanied by music. And this was for the entertainment and edification of those who were drinking in the mead hall. In Old English, the name for this poet is the shop. And at the beginning of Beowulf, a shop is described as singing the account of creation, which we looked at earlier. And Grendel is just listening quite wretchedly outside. Later in the poem, after Beowulf defeats Grendel, a shop is again referred to. Quilem Kuningesthene, Gumma Yipladen, Yida Yumundi, Sithi Ialfiala Ialgisena, Warnyamunda, Word Otherfand, Sotha Yabunden, Sedge Eft Ongan, Sith Beowulfes, Snitrum Styrian, and on Sped Vrekan, Spell Yadada, Wordum Rixlan. At times, the fane of the king, a man laden with boasting, mindful of songs, he who remembered a multitude of old stories, found other words truly bound. The man began again to tell with skills the journey of Beowulf, and successfully to narrate a skillful story, to weave together words. Here we again have that technique of poetic variation, because the narrative voice repeatedly refers to the tale which the shop has to tell. All of the boasts that he's heard from other warriors, he's Yilpladen, he has knowledge of songs, Yida, a vast number of old stories, Ialgisena, various words, another story, and finally, a weaving together of words, Wardum Rixlan. As well as telling the main plotline of Beowulf, the poem also includes many digressions which retell the legends of other heroes from Germanic mythology, again revealing the early medieval English interest in their ancestral past. Beowulf is itself a poem which probably originated from this very process of literary production described in this passage. And the Beowulf poet is in some sense being self-referential in these passages, describing the shop proclaiming poetry in the Scandinavian mead halls. This oral composition of poetry narrating the feats of heroic warriors occurred in the Germanic and Scandinavian culture from which the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes migrated, and they brought it over with them. So it informed the culture of early medieval English society. By way of conclusion, I'd like to show you the Frank's casket, an object from roughly the same time and place as Beowulf, and which could be considered in some sense a material manifestation of the poem. This small chest made of whalebone demonstrates a similar intersection of cultures as in Beowulf. The sides and top are carved with scenes from Germanic, Christian, Roman, and Jewish traditions, as well as bearing inscriptions in Latin, runes, and Old English. The viewer of this object can thus reflect on scenes from the legend of Wayland the Smith, the New Testament narrative of the adoration of the Magi, the Roman myth of Romulus and Remus, and the story of the capture of Jerusalem in 70 AD. I hope that this object shows what I've communicated over the course of this lecture, that the early medieval English were fascinated by cultural encounter, particularly in reconciling themselves with their own ancestral culture of the past, which was both pagan and Germanic. It's this which demonstrates an interest of others in their otherness. Understanding Beowulf not as a wacky and fantastical fiction about monsters, nor as a dry and inaccessible epic which depicts a dreary bygone age of savagery, enables us to appreciate the fascinating insights that this text provides to early medieval theology, literary culture, and society. Given that the poet is almost certainly a monk, we can see from Beowulf what particularly preoccupied the early medieval English church and the paradigms through which they understood spiritual and earthly reality. This poem is one of the first texts composed in the English language, and it is an impressive work of cultural encounter which underlies the English literary tradition, which is so renowned and well-loved today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, that was absolutely fabulous talk, and there's so much there's so much information coming from you throughout that. Madeline Reich says, "What is the role of heroism and devotion to a human lord as a pagan virtue, as long as not to the extent of hubris, perhaps, as opposed to the sin of pride in the Christian view? Is this addressed in the poem? It seems the two views are so opposed that they would test the nature of empathy for the other."
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think as a general answer, a lot of things that we see as quite incompatible or mutually exclusive or contradictory is usually not the case for the early medieval English, because they tend to have a lot more fluidity in the way they view these things. And I think that they often synthesize these pre-Christian structures and kind of pagan mentalities with the new Christian faith. So to give an example, a poem which is from around the same time as Beowulf is The Dream of the Rood. And this uses the comitatus structure and heroic warrior tropes more generally to talk about Christ and his crucifixion and the disciples. And the communion of saints in heaven are also depicted almost as if they're in a mead hall. celebrating in heaven. So I would say there is a way that they reconcile these different cultures, even though to us they might seem completely opposing.
Thanks for that. Do you think, just going on from what you just said there, do you think the Christian religion was simpler then, in the sense that we hadn't got all the stuff that comes later on from Aquinas and various other theologians going back to the Greeks and complicating it with the Greeks? Do you think that there was a sense of simplicity within the religion itself, which then gets complicated, which then will lead to the Reformation and all the arguments and so on?
Yeah, I think there is. I think simplicity in the sense of I think that they have very sophisticated understandings of God, but they're not presented, for example, with Aquinas in this very highly systematized fashion. It's something that's much more raw and perhaps experiential or rooted in scripture, and it doesn't extrapolate as we see later with scholasticism, which is very focused on like systematizing and kind of dissecting. This is much more imaginative and immersive and scriptural in some sense. So I would say it is simpler in the sense it's devoid of kind of philosophy or systematic structures, but nevertheless it is quite an advanced understanding of God, and they did have access to patristic texts. They had a lot of resources intellectually at their hands, so it's very high quality theology, but perhaps more raw and immersive than what we see in later spiritual traditions.
Yes, the irony is that something more simple can have greater depth. Maybe the people who try to make more depth of it, I don't know. But Joseph Simmons writes, I hope Mike will come in on this as well, perhaps. Joseph Simmons writes, thank you, Jasmine. Great presentation today. The discussion of the Mead Hall retelling successes over a shared meal with music and poetry evokes the Christian literature, which remembers. Hang on, I've lost it. Sorry, right, I've lost it. Which remembers the sacrifice and ultimate victory of the disciples' leader, Jesus. Any thoughts on the Mead Hall as possibly evoking either the Last Supper or indeed, Joe asks, or the Christian liturgy?
Really interesting. Well, as far as we know, the Mead Hall was happening in pagan cultures. So it was happening in pre-Christian Scandinavia and North Germany, from which our Anglo-Saxons and Jutes migrate. So that would suggest it's something that exists separately from Christianity. But again, I think it's something that is easily brought over into a Christian society, because as you point out with these parallels with liturgy and scripture, I do think there is a lot of resonance with the Last Supper, and it's a very ritualistic society, as I was mentioning, with the women who have this peace weaver role of passing this cup round, which cements the bonds between the different tribes and the comitatus. There's a lot of ritual, and actions are very meaningful in this culture. So I do think that there perhaps is some relationship that is formed later between the Mead Hall and these Christian equivalents, but it did exist prior to Christianity. But relating to the comitatus, they thought of grace, for example, God's giving of grace. They conceive of this as him gift giving, like a warrior lord gives treasure to his men. They saw God as giving in this very generous way to us as his men on earth. So they use these pre-Christian paradigms to relate to their then Christian culture.
Thank you. Mike, do you want to say anything?
No, you have a number of questions there, so why don't
Okay.
you go ahead? I have one thing to add if there's time, but if there's not, it will not be a great loss.
I'm sure it will. Neil Bliven says, any thoughts about the poem's monsters having any similarities with the Book of Revelation's dragon and two beasts, and even the Scarlet Woman, given that one of the monsters is female?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that's definitely a possibility. Definitely with the dragon. What's very interesting is recent research has shown that in a lot of saints' lives from this period, there's often dragons, and the saint has to defeat the dragon in a saint's life. So Beowulf is often considered hagiographical in some sense, as in based on saints' lives, because this dragon is very iconographical in that way. But in some sense, Beowulf fails because he isn't a saint. So he is killed by the dragon, for example. And the end of the poem is very tragic. It's about the end of his lineage and the redundancy of the treasure that he fought for. So I think we do have a lot of biblical echoes here. And I think the dragon in Revelation is definitely possibly one of them. I haven't thought much about the other beasts. But one idea is that Grendel, this name is very unusual in Old English, but the EL ending sounds like an angel, like Gabriel or Raphael or Michael, that EL. So some people have said this is again that fall of the angels paradigm, Grendel as a fallen angel, particularly given his relationship with Cain that the poet touches on. So yeah, lots of interesting biblical overlaps.
Interesting, because you're talking to two Michaels here as well. You know.
We are the
I never
angelic
thought of us
version.
as fallen angels, but well, maybe we are. I never thought we were angels in the first place. But the interesting thing also is the woman, because it's his mother who comes to revenge Grendel, isn't it? Yeah. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it is very interesting. I think, yeah, again, yeah.
Is it a parody, a kind of a reversal of the mother of God of Jesus? That this is the mother of the satanic. Do you see what I mean? But
Yeah,
maybe I'm pushing that too far.
no, I hadn't thought of that before. Yeah, I mean, I think the mother-son relationship is one that other Old English poems consider. And what's interesting is that she is cast as a warrior. A lot of the language is more male. For example, they use the male pronouns to relate to her in the Old English. And yeah, she's depicted as Beowulf in very similar language. So again, I don't know if it's just an imaginative endeavor of the poet to kind of make her even more formidable. But yeah, it's something that I should think more about.
Fiona Sabah says, are there many explicit metatextual references to poetry as some kind of weaving in Old English poems?
Yeah, this is a very common phrasing, the weaving of words, meaning to compose something. The reason for that is in Latin, the word text that we use now to refer to a body of writing. A text comes from textere, which means to weave. So we can see here from this word, weaving words, clearly etymologically, the Old English people have taken the Latin meaning to weave, which is where the word text comes from, and they've incorporated that into the vernacular with this weaving of words. And we definitely see that in a lot of the poetry, because it was most likely composed in this oral manner in these mead halls, for court performances and so on. So the idea of weaving words is something kind of skilled and perhaps spontaneous in some sense. Yeah, it's a very common trope.
Yes, you can't get away from it at the moment, because Mr. Trump has talked about the fact that he weaves his words.
Oh, really?
I won't go any further. I mustn't say. Emily Martin says, do you see any connections between Beowulf's theological insights and that of Old English sermons?
Yeah, we do. In particular, there's some homilies, which, again, relating to hell imagery, they're very quite intense homilies about judgment and kind of condemnation. So we think a lot of the passages relating to hell and sin come from those homilies. However, most of the Old English homilies that we have surviving come from later than Beowulf. We don't really have many from the same time because it was so early. They're mostly Latin homilies that we have surviving. There almost certainly were Old English homilies in the 8th century, because that's how people would be becoming Christian. And that's how the monks would have been being formed in their monasteries. But not many of them survive. But we do have Latin ones that this hellish kind of text comes from. And a lot of the phrases that I mentioned, which just declare the truth of Christianity in the poem, they seem very homiletic. So even if we can't trace the precise source, they derive from that kind of environment, definitely.
Thank you. There's an anonymous attendee, and we'll use this as the last question from the audience. The spiritual battle to which you refer in your presentation appears to be highly prevalent in all ancient societies. Re versus Apophis, Marduk versus Tiamat, Baal versus Yam, and in the Judeo-Christian tradition with Yahweh versus Rahab, and in Beowulf versus Grendel. Do you think there could possibly be an original religious tradition from which all of these stories originated, and it's reflected in Beowulf?
That is a really, really good question. I don't know about a single religious tradition, but I definitely think that there is so much intertextuality or cross influence between Beowulf and many different cultures. So, for example, in my own research, I've been very interested in Syriac spirituality and how there is definitely a means of transmission for Syriac into early medieval England at this period through the East and trade routes with Ireland and Archbishop Theodore becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was from that area of the world. So I do think that we haven't discovered it all yet, but I think England, despite being quite a small and isolated island at this time, is very well connected with further parts of the world. So I do think there's definitely relationships with these other traditions, but I'm not quite sure about kind of the chronology of it originating from a certain point. So yeah, that's definitely something to look more into.
Jasmine, thank you. Mike, do you want to ask your question?
Well, no, I wanted to make my comment. When I taught Beowulf, not to English majors, but as part of a general survey of English literature, we talked about the religion and the admixture of the paganism and the Christianity and the comitatus and so on. But then, in order to try to make it seem more, have some more immediacy for our own time, I used to have the students watch a Clint Eastwood movie called Pale Rider. It's the same story. The stranger comes to town to rescue the poor farmers who are being terrorized by the Grendel figures, who are cattlemen and so on. And eventually, Clint has to, of course, single-handedly fight off the monsters and bring peace to the valley. And I thought, when I asked the students to identify similarities between the Western myth and the Beowulf story, but also to speculate on why that story keeps getting told in various ways over and over again. The heroic figure who comes to town, comes to the, goes out into the mists to fight the evil, to protect the community, which is incapable of protecting itself. That myth there's something I think that goes beyond. There's something deeper in the kind of the human psyche that sees that story as relevant. Now, the sad part of that story is we have a presidential candidate who's trying to be Beowulf. I can fix it. I will protect you from them. Kind of using that motif or that paradigmatic story for his own political purposes. Now, as I said, if it were left unsaid, it would not be missed. But thank you for letting me say it.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to have to draw it to a close here. Now we've kind of started to edge onto the politics. Well, I started it with a Trump joke anyway, but never mind. Thank you, Jasmine. I just think that was a fabulous talk. Absolutely first class. Thank you. As it happens, we have booked on February the 24th to 2025. There's going to be a talk by Philip Lavender from Gothenburg University within our series on the 7 sagas of Hamlet. This is not on the source of Hamlet, but 7 sagas of Hamlet in the old, not English, but in the old languages. Yeah. So that you'd be interested in that, and interested, I'm sure, to meet Philip Lavender over the network. Next week, on Monday, the 4th of November, Ian Finley from the University of Oxford will be discussing the Book of Mormon. And this will be at the usual time of 4 p.m. because our clocks will now be in sync between the UK and the USA. Fascinating talk coming from Ian on the Book of Mormon, and obviously to do with the religion of Mormon, but he'll also be touching on the musical that's on in London at the moment called the Book of Mormon. So we look forward to that on the 4th of November. On the 13th of November, which is after the elections, at 4 p.m. UK time, we have a free speech event on the ramifications of the US elections. Where does America go next, and how is the world affected? And one of our panelists has already been, signed up, and that's going to be Susan Eisenhower, the granddaughter of the president. So that's on the 13th of November, 4 p.m. I'm sure that a lot of people will be very interested in that, and we're putting, as you can tell, a very fine panel together for that discussion. My thanks today to Georgetown University for supporting this series, especially Jack DeJoya. Again, we hope he's making a good recovery from his illness, and the Vice President of Global Affairs, Tom Banchoff. Thanks also to the administrators at Georgetown, Julia Murillo and Mary Gordon. I'd also like to thank Blackfriars Hall for their support, especially our new prior, Dominic White, John O'Connor, the Regent, and Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute, and their new UK Administrator, John Angus Donald Macaulay. Our congratulations, we must say, to Timothy Radcliffe, OP, great supporter of our series on the announcement by the Pope that he is to be elevated to become a cardinal on the 8th of December. Timothy will also be the keynote speaker at a Georgetown Campion Hall Blackfriars Conference on synodality to be held on or after on the 16th of December at Blackfriars Hall. Spaces are limited, severely limited. If those of you in the UK and in Oxford, if you want to go to that conference, you must get in touch with me or with Maggie, my wife, as soon as possible. We cannot guarantee the spaces, but spaces are limited. That's for Timothy Radcliffe on the 16th of December. I think that's it for today. We look forward to seeing you all next week and also on the 13th of November. Jasmine, thank you again. Mike, thank you again. And I thank everybody for those wonderful questions that came in. I'm Mike Scott from Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott and on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Have a nice week.